G'day painters, welcome back to Bellamar's Miniatures. We're back to Frosthaven today, painting the Drifter. Let's get to it. Drifter got undercoated with a grey Seer rattle can from Games Workshop. It's my normal go-to undercoat for models that I'm not spraying a set colour. Then the first step was to start blocking in all the brown cloth with leather brown. Next I did one part of his cloak as Greenskin. In the box art, these parts are blue, but I decided to change the blue parts to green because I think brown and green is a good look for a hunter-style character like Drifter is. Then the smaller part of the cloak I did Goblin Green. Not only is it lighter, but it's a different tone to Greenskin, so they should look different enough once it's all finished, especially because I'll highlight them in different directions. For the boots, straps, and belt, I used Oak Brown. Oak Brown is dark enough to stand out nicely against the leather brown from earlier. I also did the Quiver Oak Brown. The fletching on the arrows got hit with Dragon Red for a splash of colour. I like doing bright colours for fletching, especially because I've learnt from experience how hard it can be to find your arrows when you're shooting if the fletching isn't a bright colour. There's already a lot of brown on the model, so I decided for the wood I'd go a real dark aged looking wood. So the club, bow and dagger handle all got blocked in with Necromancer Cloak to start with. For the flesh, I used Barbarian Flesh. I've recently realised this seems to be my go-to for flesh if I don't have a specific look or colour in mind. It's a nice middle of the ground flesh tone that works for a lot of races, so I find myself reaching for it all the time. For his horns and the bones strewn around his body, I use skeleton bone to block them in. When I'm doing the highlighting, I'll take his horns further, which will help them look different to the horns adorning him. Now that all the colours are blocked in, well, other than the metal, it's time for shades. The browns, flesh, and horns all get hit with strong tone. I'm applying it heavier on the browns and lighter on the skin and horns. You could use two different shades, but it's quicker to just use one and change how heavily you apply it. The greens both got hit with a green tone. Once again, I applied it a bit lighter to the Goblin Green to just help them finish differently in the end. Time for the highlights, my favourite part. I started by working on the Oak Brown. I used Leather Brown since it was already on my palette. This model is just a quick job, so a few of the colours are only getting one layer of highlights. So for those colours, I'm just focusing on edge highlighting or spots that faced upwards and would really pick up the light. The Leather Brown got highlighted with a mixture of Leather Brown and Skeleton Bone, around 50-50. You could definitely use a different lighter brown without mixing, but I had both on my palette already, so just figured it was easier. For the stitching on the pants and the wrist guards, I used Elven Flesh to pick them out. I wanted a light colour that would stand out against both the browns, and I knew I'd be using Elven Flesh later, so getting it onto my palette now worked fine. The bones all got highlighted with Skeleton Bone next. I don't want the bones adorning him to be too bright, so this is just to bring back the mid-tone for them, and that's where I stop on them. After that though, his horns get an extra highlight with a mix of skeleton, bone and white to really help them pop and stand out as a bit different to the other bones. The skin then got a highlight with Elven Flesh, just picking out the tops of the muscles, the fingers, his brow, cheekbones, nose, all the normal parts. Looking back, I think I should have done an extra layer of highlighting for the skin. His face is a spot we want to draw attention to, so it definitely deserved a bit of extra time and effort, especially since the other parts around his face are actually going to be getting extra highlights. For the darker green parts of his cloak, I started with a mix of greenskin and snake scales. I focused on the ends of the cloak and the edges to start bringing out the highlights. Then I used snake scale to do the edge highlights and just some scratchy highlights on the end of the cloak just to give a bit of a texture to the finish. Next was the lighter green. I wanted to take this in a different tonal direction than the darker green, so I started with a mix of Goblin Green and Necrotic Flesh. Once again, just picking out the edges and the ends and any parts towards the top, like along the shoulders and that the light would hit. Then I did a final highlight with Necrotic Flesh, focusing on the very edges and the ends of the cloak. I gave the folds around his head some extra attention since that's where I want the eye to be drawn to, which is why I should have done extra highlighting on the face earlier. The fletching just got a quick edge highlight with pure red. I wanted to bring a bit more brown out on the wood, so I watered down oak brown to like a wash-like consistency and just did some glazing on the bow and the club. I didn't do this all over them, I just picked out some spots just to bring in some brown and some texture. It was at this point I realised somehow I missed doing the hair. I wanted a real yellowy blonde, so I made a mixture of Daemonic Yellow and Skeleton Bone. It gives a nice yellow blonde without it being just yellow, which would look weird. Next was the time for the metal. Overall, there isn't a lot of metal on this model, but it's all small spots that you just need to take your time on and just be careful that you're not messing up the other colours. So I took gunmetal and worked around the model, carefully picking out the studs on the club, the knife blade, and the clasps on his cloak. Then Shining Silver came out to highlight the metal. I just picked out the tip of the studs on the club and the sharp edge of the dagger. And that's him finished. Now it's time for the base. I blocked all the base in with matte white, being careful to avoid getting any on his shoes. You're going to want a couple of layers of this, especially over any of the brown that you got on the base when you were doing his shoes. The white doesn't cover great over dark colours, so just do a few extra layers. To get some shading on the white, I pulled out Apothecary white contrast paint and just applied it all over the base fairly liberally. While that dried, I grabbed Skeleton Bone and picked out the skull and bones. If I was giving more time to this model, I think I would have done the bones on the base a darker colour to make them appear older than the bones that are adorning him. But I didn't think of it at the time, I was just looking to get him ready before our session of Frosthaven that evening. Then I gave the skulls and bones a pretty heavy wash of strong tone to help darken them. I didn't do any highlighting after that, so they'd look at least a bit darker. To finish the base, I did a dry brush of white over the snow. This was a pretty light dry brush, I was just looking to hit the tips of the grooves on the snow and just pick out some of the detail. And finally, of course, I did the rim of the base black. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how Drifter came out, and 2.25 hours isn't that bad. There are a couple of points I think I should have spent a bit more time on, but as I mentioned earlier, I was rushing a bit to get him finished in time for our session that day. I can always go back and touch things up in the future. Thank you for watching, and I hope this video has helped with some ideas for getting Drifter painted for your game. If you'd like to see the rest of the Frosthaven characters painted, hit that subscribe button. And if you've hung around this long, you might as well hit the like button too. Catch you in the next video.